So if you just joined us there, welcome along to our first quick learn session. We're looking at batch invoices and batch credits in today's session. Session should last around about 20 minutes. So I'm expecting probably a 10 to 15 minute demonstration, followed by me picking up any questions that you might have as well. So keep your questions coming. I'll try and answer as many as I can. Now, very short agenda for what we're covering, so a little bit of background to batch invoices and credits. We'll then concentrate on the demonstration, and then I'll just mention a little bit about the additional support and pick up any questions that you might have as well. So let's get started then. So a little bit of background first of all. So batch invoices and credits, when might you use it and why might you use it, as opposed to the likes of the invoices and credits option? Well, batch invoices and credits, it's a quick way to record a transaction against a customer or a supplier account. So getting that transaction onto their activity. The transactions will appear on the activity as either an SI or an SC, so a sales invoice or a sales credit if it's a customer, or a PI or a PC if it's against a supplier. Now, one thing they don't do is they don't generate an invoice or a credit note that you can actually email out or print. So they don't generate an actual document, and they also don't integrate with your products and services list. So it's likely you would enter a batch invoice where maybe you use other software to generate invoices, or you just receive it and you don't need to generate a document. So in the form of a supplier, for instance, you receive that through the post or you emailed it, and you just want a quick way of establishing that balance against the customer or supplier account. Also, maybe if you handwrite your invoices. So if you've got someone on site with a customer, they generate the invoice there and then, and you just need to record that into your accounts. So that's what we're going to look at in the software. And again, keep those questions coming. Now, if anyone needs it, obviously you can get into the help center and just search for batch invoices, and it will find the information that we're going to be using today. So a couple of points in the demonstration. We're just going to run through the batch invoice screen, explain the options that you've got available, and then what I want to do is pick up on transaction grouping, because that's something that's really beneficial to understand in the software. So I'm going to look at that and how it applies to batch invoices and credits when you're entering those. Let's switch across to my screen and we'll get stuck into a demonstration. Now, in this session that we're going to be following, the demonstration, I'll just pick on customers as an example. If you can enter a batch invoice against a customer, you'll be able to do a batch credit. Similarly, if you can do them against a customer, you can do those types of transactions against a supplier. So we're just going to pop into customers, just make sure I've got the right screen shared, which I do. So we'll pop into customers, and then I'm going to choose the batch invoice option. Now, the first thing we're prompted to do is choose an account reference. Now, if you know your account references, you can obviously just start typing them in. Otherwise, just a case of selecting it from the list. And this is one of the reasons with account references that when we say, right, try and make it meaningful to yourself, try and use something like an abbreviation of the customer's name. So if you can do that, it's going to make it that bit easier to find. If you're on version 29 as well, you've also got what we term the quick search option at the top. So you could type an abbreviation or of just some of the information that's contained within the customer's account, and then click this little icon at the top there, and it'll narrow down your list. If I just cancel out of that though, for all of the versions where you don't have that, the quick search option, just a case of you can press F4 or F3 on your list, it'll access the drop down, and then it's just a case of selecting it from the list. So I've set up a few accounts for us to use today. So just choose this one. It's a brand new account. There's no transactions posted to it yet, so we'll select that one. You'll see it picks up today's date for me. Now, if you're in the habit of not closing the software down, so maybe at the end of the day, if you lock Sage and just lock your PC, when you come back to it, it'll not automatically have advanced that date. So if you're finding it's got an old date on there, just either close the software, come back in, or you can go to settings, change program date within your software. So it'll pick up that date. You can easily change it as well if needed. Next, you've got your due date. Now your due date will be calculated automatically for you. Again, you can override that if required. Your due date will look at the payment due option within the credit terms or the credit control tab of the customer's record or the supplier's record if you're looking at a supplier invoice. So it's going to look at the payment date plus the payment due from setting as well. Now by default, it's going to be set to 30 days from the invoice date, but there may be other terms that you want to specify instead. So it might be 7 days from the first day of the following month that you might have set, and it would just pop in your date accordingly. But by default, it's going to be 30 days from the invoice date. So if you change the date here, it should automatically calculate your due date for you. You will be able to override that as well if needed. Just tabbing along to the next field, we've got our reference. Now, reference is where you're most likely to record the invoice number. Now, it is a alphanumeric field, that one, so it doesn't just have to be numerical. You can enter whatever you want. Now, with regard to the batch invoice option in both customers or suppliers, there's no automated numbering system for that one. You will need to enter it manually. So we'll just do 001. You've also got an extra reference as well. So whatever you want to use and enter into that one. That's entirely up to you what you use it for. It might be you have some sort of document and you might have some sort of, internal reference number that you write on that. You might use it for something completely different. We then come on to the nominal code. Nominal code, again, that would be picked up by default from the customer record or the supplier record. Again, you can override that as well. So it's just picking up 4,000 from the customer's record in my instance. You've got the department next, which again will also be picked up from the customer account. So within the customer's defaults within their record, it will include a department option. So again, you can override that if required. Next, we've got a project reference. Now, the project reference, it's only going to be available to you if you've got the projects option enabled within your software. And the projects option is only available to you if you're on the professional level of the software. Now, in the customers area, when entering an invoice, you'll also only be able to enter a project reference. For suppliers, when you're entering a purchase invoice, you'll all be, as well as being able to enter a project reference, you'll also be able to enter a cost code as well. So you'll have that extra column when entering a purchase invoice. Again, these options they're all similar. Click on the drop down, it will give you a list to choose from. In the details, enter some information. Now, with regard to the details, you can have up to 60 characters, and you will get this, what we term the pop-up as well. So if you find a typo in amongst this as well when you're typing, let me just select one. I can right click and you can delete it, or you can delete it all. So if you're forever, a bit like myself, where we've got a typo on that list there, so it's always bringing up cervix rather than services. Then you can do that. So if I just do it again, bring up the list, and I can right click and delete. It just stops me selecting that one each and every time. So nice and easy, get rid of typos if you've got one. Next, you've got the net. So key in the net value. If you don't know the net value, maybe you've only know the gross value, you can key that in. So let's say if I keyed in 120 as an example, I can then click on calculate net at the top. And based on the tax code that I've got selected, it will work out the net and the VAT for me. Obviously, if you did know that, it would just calculate automatically. Tax code is also picked up from the customer record as well. Again, you can overwrite it if necessary. Finally, you've got your gross column. Now the gross column, it's brand new column in version 29. That it's read only. It'll just add up the net and the VAT for you, so it'll show that one on the list. Again, maybe if you're just keying it in, just that cross check that you've entered everything correctly. The final four columns you've got are to do with, do you want to post a receipt at the same time? So customer, you may have invoiced them and actually you've already received a payment against it. So to save you having to go and do that separately, you could just enter it at this point. So filling in the amount paid, the date, which bank account the money was paid into, and if you have one, also a payment reference. And other than that, you would be ready to save it at that point. So as you can see, it's a really quick way of just getting the information, just top level information. You're not getting involved with products or service records. It's just establishing that balance against that customer's account. Now, while I'm in here, I want to talk a little bit about grouping as well. So what I'll do is I'll quickly enter another transaction and I'm going to enter it against the same account. Now I'll use today's date. Obviously it calculates the same due date. I'll pop in a different reference this time, but I'll accept the rest of the details. So I'll do exactly the same information all the way through, and I'll come down to a third line. Now on the third line, I'm going to say there's two items for invoice number 2 that I want to show a breakdown of. So I'm just pressing F6. F6, as you'll see on the toolbar at the top, this one here, it copies the information above, so it's just copying it down when I press F6. Now, if I just keep tabbing at that point, so keep pressing F6, this time I'll say products. It's another typo in there. So this time we'll say products and also put a value in. Now, when I do that this time, you'll see what it's done is it's potentially spotted a duplicate. So have you already entered that information? And it's because essentially it's got the same information. It's ignoring the details, but because it's got the same, it's against the same customer, it's got the same date, same reference, same nominal code, and also it's the same value as well. And it's saying, right, is this a mistake or not? Are you entering it again? So have you been interrupted and you've saved it? And have you come back to pick up where you left and you've accidentally keyed in it again? So that's what that option is designed for. So what I'll do this time, I'm just going to change the nominal code. And what I'll also do is I'll change the value as well. So in this instance, we've got an invoice 002 posted against this customer. It's got the same date, same reference, different nominal codes. You might also choose to split the transaction because maybe one of the items on the invoice or part of the invoice is VATable at standard rate, or maybe the other items are VATable at 0 rate or exempt or need to use a different tax code. So nominal codes and tax codes are probably the most common reasons for needing to split your invoices. If you didn't need to split it, you could just enter the whole invoice on one line. Now, what I'll do at that point, I'm ready to save it. So we close out. So as you can see, very easy to enter a batch invoice or a batch credit. And if we go into the customer's account that we've just entered that transaction for, so this one here, it's now got a balance against it. We'll just go into it, have a look at the activity. And what we'll see this time is we just see the two transactions. So we see the first one, 001, and then we see the second one, 002. Now 002, remember, had two lines to that invoice. And if I click onto that line, you'll see I've got the breakdown in this lower box here. If you come into the activity and you don't see that, it's just a case of toggling between the information at the top. So you can hide detail or show detail if you want the two boxes. So that's the sort of the breakdown. Now, the reason for the grouping working, it's because when I entered the transactions, so within batch invoice, I entered them against the same customer. I entered them on the same screen, so they were consecutive as well on that list. So it means it has to be the same customer account reference, the same date, and the same reference. If those three things match and the transactions are consecutive on that list, it will group the transactions together. Now, Once it's grouped as well, you can't then ungroup that transaction manually. It will still list it as individual items when you come to pay it, for instance, but it will be a group transaction. The only way you could ungroup that, if that is the case, would be to delete the transaction and re-enter it. The other option to avoid grouping, if you don't like the way the grouping works, is to enter the first line and save it, enter the second line and save it, then enter the third line and so forth. And that would list that then as individual transactions. So it's those three columns that determines the grouping: the account reference, the date, and the reference. If they are the same, the transactions are consecutive. When you save it, it'll group them together. The other thing I want to quickly mention while we're in this screen as well is to just do with your columns. If there's anything that you don't want to specify, so we mentioned earlier about the extra reference, you may or may not use it. So rather than you have that field and ignore it every time, what you can do, and this is available just about anywhere within the software, if I right-click a column heading, it'll show me which columns I can then show or hide. So if I didn't want to see the extra reference, for instance, when I'm in this screen, I can just switch that off. Maybe you'll never record a receipt at the same time as entering an invoice. So again, I can just hide one of these columns. And because I'm hiding one of them, essentially these four are linked when I right click. So if I hide one of them, it'll hide the others. So if there's anything you don't want to see, it will move it from the list. We can always get those back as well just by right clicking any of the column headings and switching them back on, or clicking use defaults, and it'll reset that list for me as well. Hope that makes sense. So a good little tip, that one. If there's a column you do switch off, so for instance, department, you might think, well, I always wanted to pick up the default department and never want to change that. So although it will pick up that default department, if I was to hide that column and then enter another transaction, so let's do number 3 as an example. And we'll just save it. Actually, I'll enter a value, that would probably help. We go in to have a look at the activity. And you'll see it's picked up the default department. So it's picked up that for the transaction in the background, just picking up the default. So it means it's picking that up without me having to select that or tab past that field each and every time, because I never change it. Right, now that brings me to the end of the demo. If you've got any questions, please pop them into the questions panel, and we'll try and clear or provide an answer for anything you might have a question on. Just to let you know about some of the other quick learn sessions that we've got planned in for the time being. If I just pop back to the slides, well, it gives you a chance to enter any questions that you might have. So we've covered obviously batch invoices and credits today. We'll be looking at customer receipts next week. Week after, customer refunds. We'll then be looking at batch supplier payments, and then the final session this month will be bank payments and receipts. Again, they're very similar, them two, so we've grouped them together. So those are the quick learn sessions for May. Other sessions that we've got planned for this month as well will take a sort of a stock theme. So we're looking at the products and services area. So if you're interested in signing up for any of those, watch out for your follow-up email. And it just means obviously you can get signed up for those. Margaret, question from yourself? Just mention about could I quickly explain the advantage of grouping aspect again, please? The main one is, I suppose, it's when you need a breakdown. So let me just go back to my screen. Now let's say when I'm entering a transaction, I might have an invoice or a credit note for that matter, where when I receive that, let's say from one of my suppliers, maybe it's got 50 lines on it, but actually I don't need to break that down. I could just show it as one item. But if I do need to show a breakdown, it would group the transactions together, so that say those 50 lines, it would group them together. And what it means is when I come into the likes of the customer receipt window, I get this little extra option. So let me just quickly select that customer. So it was that one there. And what we've got here is we've got invoice number 1 and we've got invoice number 2, and you can see the breakdown of those 2 lines that are put on there. Now, let's say I just wanted to come in and show an invoice having been paid or a full receipt against it. If it was 50 lines, I'll be going down, pay in full, pay in full, pay in full, pay in full, all the way down that list. But I've got this little toggle box here. If I take the tick out, I now just see a total for that specific transaction. So it's got its benefits. Some people like the way it groups, others prefer just to show all the transactions individually. Also means on the likes of, and you may be familiar with it, when you generate statements, you can choose a grouped statement or an individual statement. So a grouped statement would just show almost equivalent of what we've got here. We've got 1 line per outstanding invoice, whereas if we're showing an individual statement, it would show the breakdown. Elizabeth, you mentioned why is your supplier not showing when you go to reconcile after you enter a batch invoice? For a supplier not to be showing when you go to enter a payment, for instance, or a receipt, it would probably mean that you've got some sort of filter applied to your list. So make sure when you go into suppliers, as an example, make sure it says all records. If it doesn't, and I suspect that's probably the case, yours will say, in my case, like say 10 of 14 records, for instance. That means I haven't got that full list displayed. So it probably means I've got a filter applied. So what you want to do is just come into here, make sure you click apply filter or remove filter in your instance, I think. So rather than it saying X of 14 records in my case, what I want it to say is all records. That's the key. When it's all records, it means there's no filter applied. So do check that on your suppliers list. I think that'll be the only reason why maybe it's missing. Beyond that, make sure they are in, say, account reference order as well. Gina, you're mentioning as well, when you want to raise a credit note for part of an invoice, do you delete all items on the invoice and record the items you want to credit? Or does this affect stock? Again, what we covered today is we've looked at the batch option. So if you're raising a batch credit, whether it's against a customer or a supplier, that does not impact on the products and services area. So it doesn't impact on stock. Again, it's just a quick way of establishing that transaction against that account. If you needed the transaction to impact on the likes of stock, for instance, so let's say we got a customer and we need to credit part of their invoice, if we need that to impact on the stock levels, then we wouldn't enter it as a batch credit. What you'd be doing is you'd be going into the invoice and credits option and generating your credit from within there. So this is the option, invoice and credits. This is the option that integrates with your products and services list. So if you are recording stock levels, that's where you'd need to do that. Now, it is quite possible as well that obviously if you're generating invoices directly from within the software, within customers, you might not use the batch invoices and batch credit. You might always generate those ones within the invoice and credits area only, so that you can generate a document and email it or print it. Whereas on the supplier side, obviously that's you're going to be sent that either that printed document or emailed, maybe probably a PDF copy. So that's a good way, probably more likely in suppliers, of just getting that transaction onto the account to show it as an outstanding balance. But again, works in pretty much the same way. You've got virtually identical columns. Again, you can right click the relevant columns as well. As you can see, I've got quite a few of them switched off. but just go back to use defaults and you've got pretty much the same. So if you can enter a batch invoice or a batch credit in one of the areas, you would be more than capable of doing it in the others. Right, so that just about brings us to the end of today's session. If you think of anything afterwards, do get in touch. But remember, the information is readily available within our help centre, really easy to find. And again, if you can take a minute just to complete this short survey, that should pop up as you leave today, we greatly appreciate it. Brand new sort of approach that we're taking for webinars, trying to shorten sharp sessions. So if you've got any feedback around that, please let us know. Also, if there's any topics you'd like to see us cover going forward as well, let us know. Follow-up email should be with you in round about an hour's time. For now, I'll bid you goodbye. Take care, stay safe, and hopefully we'll see you on some other sessions soon. Many thanks.